Part 24. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gongwei Pang. Chapter 234. Yanj didn't answer. The prince raised her chin with her fingers and asked her, "Jun Jun, what are you thinking?" Thinking of His Royal Highness Yan Ji was a little dazed in his eyes. "I think I'm not as good as His Royal Highness. I only have a beautiful skin. Without this skin, there is nothing." The prince laughed, and poked his forehead with his fingers. "Silly cute." Words of song. The prince's health gradually improved, but he did not let Yanj continue to appear in front of men in men's clothing. Yanj is not impatient. She always feels comfortable when she meets her. She always sits beside the prince to help him clean up the table or help him read those books and memorials when he is tired. The relationship between the two seemed extraordinarily harmonious, and everyone said that the prince was petting a beautiful lady, who would carry it wherever he went, almost inseparable. The rumor was misleading, and when the queen in the palace heard the rumor, she deliberately made people call the song. The prince has no son-in-law today, and the queen is very anxious about this. She wants to let the palace person help Yan Ji look at her body so that she can easily conceive. However, this imperial decree was stopped by the prince's words after arriving at the prince's mansion. "She waits for me daily, where can I go to the palace?" The queen was not reconciled, and she sent a few puppets to Yan Ji, but the puppets were also returned by the prince. She didn't know about it, she just felt that the palace was too quiet and not normal at all. This time Su Qiuqiu also came to Beijing to make a name with the great song. Su Qiuqiu loved beauty, and it was said that the beauty who had pulled several cars away when he left. People in the government took this as a joke, but Yanj knew that this was the real thing. The host Guo Su also pulled a few cars away from the beauties. She did not enter the palace this time, and her destiny was very different from that of her host. However, what surprised her most was Prince Edward. There was a palace banquet about Su Qiuqiu in the palace, and the prince was among them. At that time, Su Qiuqiu also asked the prince for the legendary beautiful concubine in his house. The prince rejected it at once. He said at the time, "Hamiya has cleanliness, and Mayamiya's beauty is to let her die and not let other men touch him." These words were spoken in front of so many courtiers, and they spread throughout the capital the next day. Such words are spoken from the mouth of a prince, which will make courtiers and emperors instantly lower the senses of the prince. After all, it is not commendable for a prince to delay beauty. After listening to the incident from the waiter around, Yan Ji did not respond for a while. The waiter thought she was moved. But she was full of MMPs. She always had the illusion that the prince had been setting her on the fire recently. The emperor's performance at the banquet probably disappointed the emperor, so after that, the prince was obviously idle. The staff and guests around him were very anxious, but the prince was not ill. He either read a book in the study or guarded the beauties. Yanj was completely put on the fire shelf, and the entire great song knew that the prince was not thinking about making progress for a beauty. She felt that it would be a matter of time before the emperor brought her into the palace. The prince is such a high-profile tanning beauty, is this going to send her to the palace? Ethereum's temperament is not like someone who can do this kind of thing. Yan Ji was puzzled, but he never asked. In such an era, all she can do now is soldiers to cover the water and cover the earth. It's about self-cultivation. Prince Edward's recent physical condition is quite good. Men and women's affairs between the bed mantles gradually increased. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gongwei Pang. Chapter 235. Forget it, even if you touch it many times, this guy still has black hair and can't pull a few hairs, but if he wakes up, he can't make it. After the singer paused, the prince's eyes opened. His black and white eyes were fixed on Yanj. His Royal Highness Yanj was a little guilty of being a thief. She put her hand on the prince's quilt and helped him pull the quilt up. Her voice softly advised, "It's early, and you can sleep for a while." Whatever morning it was, the sun came into the room. The prince reached out and held the words in hand. He seemed to want to sit up, and Yanj was busy placing the pillow behind the prince. "His Royal Highness, what do you want?" "There is a set of your men's clothing in the cabinet, and the powder containers you usually use are all in it," said the prince. "You don't fit the clothes when you try them." She hasn't worn men's clothing for a long time. Yan Ji thought that this guy was about to hang up, and she should be more restrained. Why did she suddenly want her to wear men's clothing? Could it be possible to remember? Yan Ji put on the purple men's robe according to the words. This set of men's clothing is also a high collar. The robe is embroidered with golden silk moire, and there are dark bamboo leaf embroidery. A purple gold jade belt and a smoke cage shirt are worn on Yanj's body. Pinacious young man. Soon she made up her male makeup. Going to the prince, she turned with a smile, "His Royal Highness, how is it?" The prince smiled, "Yes." He shouted to the outdoors, "Kingda." Yanji immediately smiled, and stood down beside the prince's bed with his hands folded around his waist and abdomen. It was very normal, just like her attitude when she was a book boy in the past, nothing like a woman. The prince's gaze fixed on her, and she immediately turned away. Qingda also took a woman behind him. The woman came in and saluted, saw the prince beckoning, and looked up at the prince. When the woman entered the door, Yanj noticed that although the woman's head was hanging slightly, no matter how she looked at the song, she felt that the woman had a sense of acquaintance. The woman looked up at this moment, and her feeling became clearer. The prince narrowed her eyes and the woman retracted her eyes. He told Kingda, "There are clothes in the cabinet." Qingfei led the woman toward the cabinet. Yanji just opened the cabinet. She also wore a set of women's clothing next to the men's clothing. She thought it was her own clothes, so she didn't care. When the woman changed her clothes and came out, Yan Song suddenly realized. She finally knew why she always saw women so familiar. The dress she wore was the women's dress she had just worn, but although it was exactly the same as hers, she was still throwing them in. The woman's head was combed with the flying magpie she liked to comb, face is also her favorite plum makeup. When the woman was so dressed, Yan Ji suddenly felt like she was standing in front of another. When the woman came out, the prince beckoned again. The woman knelt beside the prince's bed. The prince asked her, "But what's left?" The woman shook her head, raised her head a little and looked gratefully at the prince, and immediately lowered her head again. "Uncle Qing has helped me solve it, I have no regrets, thank you, Your Highness." "Well," the prince answered. Yanj may have doubts at the beginning, but now she heard the dialogue between the prince and the woman, like a gimmick, and instantly understood the intention of the prince. As she was about to speak, the voice of the father-in-law came from the door, "The queen's decree, please Chuji to take the decree." This time the father-in-law was the father-in-law of the emperor. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gongwei Pang. Chapter 236. With the memory of the host, Yanj was very impressed by the red-headed prince beside the emperor. Grand Master Qing opened the door, and the father-in-law looked at the woman standing by the bed in the room, saluting the prince. Then he smiled and said, "His Royal Highness, the Queen has the intention to pass to Chuji, and the slave-in-law specifically instructed the slave-in-place to leave." "I'm surprised, you see, why don't you let Chuji go to the yard?" The prince looked up and stared at the prince. "What is the imperative? Read it here." The father-in-law accompanied with a smile on his face and said in a distressed expression, "His Royal Highness, please don't embarrass the old slave." This was handed to Chuji by the queen's wife. Maybe it was a few words in private. The queen told her to read it out. To avoid people, your royal highness, you will be considerate to the old slaves. Although the prince was unhappy, he eventually compromised. He told the women around him, "Come back early to take medicine in this palace." The woman gave a soft hum before she followed the father-in-law and walked out. The prince seemed unsure, and said to Kingda aside, "You follow." Ching hurried away. Until everyone was gone, Yan Ji only walked to the prince's bed in a few steps. She moved her lips and wanted to ask, but said nothing. The prince also looked at her. He said, "Jun Jun, as you wish. If you want to be the regent over 10,000 people, I will help you. Do my best to help you." He said, "Since then, there has been no Chuji, only Song Zijun from a book boy." Yan Ji nodded, with thousands of words in his chest, but couldn't say a word. She had no idea that the prince would treat her like this one day. Suddenly, she couldn't tell whether it was his true feelings or hypocrisy. The woman never came in after she went out. The father-in-law hurried away without leaving. Kingda entered the door and said to the prince, "Given a glass of poisonous wine," and the body was taken away. The father-in-law wanted to tell his royal highness that the queen likes Chuji, so let Chuji live in the palace for some time. Fearing that the people of Prince Edward's house would block it, the father-in-law first asked the little father-in-laws around him to hold down the woman and drink poisonous wine, and then let Kingda pass such a message. Knowing that Kingda would not lie here with the prince, the father-in-law was afraid that the prince would find him to settle accounts, so he hurried away with the woman's body. "Grab the body back and bury it thickly," said the prince, and turned to Yanj, "You lead Kingda, and it will be left to you." Yanj suppressed the emotions of the chest rolling, and the court prince solemnly saluted, "Yes. This is the first task after Yanj became Song Zijun. This task seems simple, but it will make her be a prince's confidant in the future, and it will also become the label of the enemy with those in the palace. But how about that? Given the opportunity to soar into the sky, how could she look forward and look back? She and Kingda took almost all the people who could fight in the prince's mansion. They chased the prince in a mighty manner, and blocked the prince in front of the palace gate. Where can a few people from the prince gong be prepared to sing and sing all over the crowd? He wanted to overpower others, but the whisperers only listened to the prince's order and robbed the woman's body in the carriage. Quickly headed for Prince's house. However, half a quarter of an hour, there were several waves of Prince's house going out to the palace to invite the imperial doctor who is good at poisoning in the palace and the famous doctors in Beijing. Not only the people in the palace, but also the people in all the prince's palaces are watching the movement of the prince's palace. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Weipang. Chapter 237. Not long after the doctors entered the prince's mansion, there was news that the prince was seriously ill and unconscious. At this point, there is no news that the prince's palace is a piece of iron. Those doctors who have entered the prince's palace have not been able to leave the house. Until the next day, the doctors and physicians returned to their homes. Someone inquired about them immediately. Naturally, I also knew that the Crown Prince Chuji, who was most cherished by the Crown Prince, was fed to see the blood-sealed throat of the crane-top red, who had died, and the Crown Prince was despondent to cause relapse. Chuji is dead, and naturally she will be buried. She was buried in the yard where Chuji lived. Chuji's tombstone was blank and she never wrote. After handling all these things, Yanj was waiting in the ear chamber of the prince. She thought the prince would summon her, but she didn't. Kingda arranged her in the places where the guests of Prince Edward lived. Since then, there has been no Chuji. Therefore, the relationship between her and the prince will no longer be a relationship between men and women, but a subordinate relationship. Yan Ji sighed in bed, hugging the pillow. In fact, my heart is very excited. There is a kind of excitement like a fish entering the sea, but when I am excited, I feel a little stunned. The prince was ruthless and ruthless. She told her to give up. She had the courage and the wrist, and at first glance she was a person doing big things. It's a pity that his broken body is holding back. It was a year and a half after Chijia Dalan returned from the border. In just 1.5 years, the battles at the borders made him rise step by step. He was promoted by General Che riding to General Wu Vai. He heard the death of Chu Ji and went to the prince's house after receiving the reward. When the prince saw him, Yan Song studied the ink beside the prince. She has now taken up the official post and has become a waiter beside the prince. Not only does he help the prince, but everything in the prince's house will pass through her hands. Chijia Dalang originally came from the dust, but when he saw the song beside the prince, he was a little stunned, and then he calmed down the irritability in his eyes. He went to the tea room to drink tea and chat with the prince, and Yan Ji never followed. His footsteps fell slightly behind the prince, and when he came to the door, he couldn't help but turn back, and Yanj was still sorting out some papers in prince's study. Realizing his gaze, Yan Ji smiled politely at him. His eyes were dim, and he wanted to respond with a smile, but his expression was cold until he turned around. After Kijia Dalan left, the prince did not have the purpose of Kijia Dalan to come to Prince Edward on the premise of speaking. On the second day, the little sister next to Yanj handed a letter from Kijia Dalan to Yanj. The doorman sent me an invitation letter from General Wu Vai, and invited Master Song to join Wu Vai General's celebration party. Yanj took the letter and told the prince about it again. The prince responded indifferently, "If you are invited, go." Yan Ji nodded, and still wanted to speak. Then he heard the prince said, "General Wu Wei also handed a post to this palace. In the evening, you go in the carriage of this palace." Yan Ji has not had the honor of riding in the prince's carriage for a long time, and she couldn't help it. "I always feel that the prince is exuding jealousy. Is she thinking too much?" For more than a year, the body was probably not allowed, and the prince had always been abstinent. She really felt that this guy had given up on love. After getting on the carriage, Yanj didn't sit under the prince as usual. She sat in the corner of the carriage door, and tried to keep her presence as low as possible. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Wei Pang. Chapter 238. The prince's car is very shock-proof, and it is almost free of bumps and vibrations, just like in the clouds. Yanj was almost asleep by the car. At some point, the prince heard her asking, "Are you sorry?" Yanj was a spirit, looking up at the prince in confusion. The prince was looking at her with certainty, all eyes were puzzled. She could have enjoyed Jinyi, she didn't have to travel around, and even a 95th Supreme likes her to spoil her and protect her, but it's for a very risky one that can be taken apart at any time and is not her own identity. She gave up everything, she would not succeed, would not regret it. He raised his chin and said, "This palace can give you a chance to regret it." Yan Ji looked at him with gratitude, respectful salute, "Thank your highness." But when she raised her head, her expression was firm, although she sometimes regrets it. This road is for her subordinates, and her subordinates want to finish this road, so as to live up to the highness of her highness. The prince's fingertips moved, but he didn't speak again. He retracted his eyes and leaned on the pillow, as if taking a nap. At the General Wu Vai mansion, the position of Yanj was not the same as that of the prince. And most of the participants in the banquet were generals, and the scenes were incompatible with the words. After 3 rounds of drinking, the prince probably went to divide and left the field with General Wu Wei. These generals let go of their lively fight. The dancing women also started to dance. Words of song. Fortunately, she was sitting in a corner, and it was still very inconspicuous. The 2 people sitting around were probably in the bottom of their careers and had been drinking down their heads. The prince was gone a long time ago, and a small cricket who had been serving her around whispered to her and said, "Servant Song, the general wants to say a few words to you, can you move?" Yanj glanced at Xiaoch, who was busy handing General Wu Wei's warrant to Yanj. After confirming that it was General Wu Wei, Yan Ji got up and left with Xiao. When she left, she noticed that the people sitting in the left and right positions were relieved. The expression was like sending away a plague god. Can these two men be escorted for her? Yan Ji's doubts flickered by, and she followed Xiao through a garden. The silk and bamboo sounds in the yard gradually went away, and she felt a sense of distance. You're waiting in the distance. Someone suddenly made a noise, but it was General Wu Wei, who hadn't waited for a long time by the corridor. Xiao Yan got the words, busy hiding in the night. Yanj took a step back and kept a little distance from General Wu Wei, chanting, "Congratulations to the general." Before she finished speaking, General Wu Wei raised his hand to grab her wrist. Yan Ji stepped back again and turned to the side again. She opened the folding fan that was not in her waist and was pinched in her hand. She raised her eyebrows and asked coldly, "Why is this, General?" The folding fan is a hidden weapon-like self-defense thing that Kingda helped her to build. If you do open the machine, it is no different from a normal fan, but when the machine is opened, the poisonous needle hidden in the fan will pop up. There are no lanterns under this corridor, and the night is dark, but General Wu Wei at this moment can clearly see the alertness and precaution on Yan Ji's face. Only after knowing it later did he know his own mistakes. He said quickly, "Shaojun, I'm your tiger brother, don't be afraid of me, I won't tell you what happened." Brother Huzi, this is the name of the host's Hejia Dalan when he was young. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Wei Pang. Chapter 239. But later, Brother Huzi disappeared completely in the memory of the host, replaced by countless betrayal men. Yan Ji didn't know how the people in front of her looked at her camouflage, and she took a step back again and settled down and said, "General, my name is Song Zijun." After waiting for General Wu Wei to speak, she lowered her voice and said, "The girl in General's mouth must be Chu Ji in Prince's mansion." The general is so affectionate that she still remembers her, but she had suffered from illness in previous years. His death was a pity. Shaojun Chi Jiadalan's voice also lowered. He almost pleaded generally and hurriedly said, "Shaojun, I know it is you. Do you have any troubles like this? What do you want to do? Whatever you want, I can help you. If you want to leave the prince's control, I can also help you, Shaojun, you." He took a step forward, trying to capture the words, but the words took 2 steps back to distance him again. "General Wu Wei, you admit the wrong person." Yan Ji met his eyes, only compassion and sympathy on his face. General Wu Wei's infatuation admired Zijun, but the beauty is dead, the general is nothing else, even for my sake people in Song should also take care of their bodies. Kijia Dalan's lips closed tightly. The next moment, he suddenly rushed to the words. Yanj's fan was closed, the fan's pointed dagger came out of the sheath, and her fan hit the Kijia Dalan to shake her hand. "I thought this guy would dodge, but I didn't expect that the dagger cut through his wrist, and he didn't avoid it either, pinching Yanj's wrist or turning it over. Blood dripped from the wrist like silk thread, but he didn't care, just looking at the words and continued to say, "Shaojun, I don't recognize the mole on your wrist. If you still want to justify, I will tear my clothes and look at you carry your birthmark." Yan Song looked up and stared at him. Kijia Dalan bowed his head slightly, the coldness in his eyes gradually softened in the eyes of Yan Song, his throat rolled, and he whispered, "Shaojun, don't deny me." Yanj sneered, and his eyes rolled angrily. "Chu Ji in the prince's mansion is dead, and the person that the general is longing for has already become a pile of bones. If the general insists on treating me as the person in the general's heart, it would be better to kill me now." This affectionate look in Yan Ji's eyes, not half touched, only feel cold, if really love, Why the host never appeared in that life? General, I am a talent that Prince Edward fancy and wants to cultivate. I am like a fish in Prince Edward house. I can get what I want and I need. Even if I can't get it, there is a prince to help me. I am jealous that I am a prince, so do you want to separate me from the prince? General, although I'm not talented, I still have the backbone. She turned her fan, and pointed her dagger at her own neck. If the general is determined to compare me with Chuji, if he really wants to take off my official uniform, I'd rather step over my body first. Chijia Dalan finally lost in Yan Ji's decisive but scornful eyes. He slowly let go of Yan Ji's hand, his voice was bitter. I have no other meaning, Chi owes you a lot, I just want to help you. The words were unmoved, the Chi family owes Chuji, and I am Song Zijun, and I have nothing to do with Chuji. Chijia Dalan did not speak. Yan Song escaped his restraint and turned to go, but the sky was dark and she was unfamiliar with the road. She was tripped and slipped to the side by a pebble. Kijia Dalan busy reached out and embraced the words in a timely manner. What is this, General? The prince's leisurely voice sounded at this moment. I thought the general was busy, and I never thought it was to enjoy the scenery with the beauty, but this palace interrupted you. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Wei Pang. Chapter 240. Chijia Dalan wanted to pull Yan Ji behind him, but Yan Ji avoided Chijia Dalang's hand and took a step to salute the prince, His Royal Highness, Song Zijun, who was a humble job. A hand. She didn't believe it was an accident at this time. She didn't even believe that the prince hadn't noticed her. Mom, shouldn't this be a special cover that the prince gave her? When thinking about what the prince had said, wherever she was touched by a man, she would chop her off, and Yanj felt numb. This man is so jealous that she really doesn't want to see at all, let alone touch his bottom line at this time. It turned out to be Zijun. The prince smiled, it is dazzled by this palace, and he is also a beauty that the general would not even accompany this palace. Look at the words, it really is the words of the song that are blowing the cold wind behind. Yan Ji walked to the prince in a few steps, ignoring the prince's innocent words. Are you going to return to your house? Your humble job just happened to leave the seat, and begging your highness for a ride. The prince proudly hummed, yes. General Wu Wei on the side said quickly, it is a shame that his highness has handled a little chores and neglected his highness. Anyway, the prince's voice was indifferent, the general affairs are busy. It is not like the palace is a laid-back person. The general is busy, and the palace should return to the house. General Wu Wei shouted that people took the lantern and he personally held the light to lead the way. The prince coughed a few times, and Yanj quickly asked, Your Highness, but it's cold. She took the cloak from behind the waiter's hand and put it on the prince, and walked beside the prince. His Royal Highness, the road is not smooth. May I help you? The prince put his arms up on Yan Ji. On the side of General Wu Wei, his steps slowed, his back was straight, he heard the movement behind him clearly, his lips clenched, and he kept looking forward. The prince's car was parked in the yard. After the prince got on the car, he said to the song that he was going to jog with the car, Song, please get on the car. The words suddenly flattered, thank you incessantly, thank your highness. At the end, he turned around and sneered at General Wu Wei, General, leave. General Wu Wei nodded slightly, and his eyes fell on Yan Ji's body without any trace. It was only at the moment that Yan Ji spoke, that he could reflect his disability. His throat rolled, and to the eyes of Shanj, his words that were about to be exited were pressed back again, and he only responded to the head of Yanj. As soon as she entered the carriage, Yanj's clothes were pulled by the prince. She had not spoken yet. The prince had overwhelmed her in the carriage. Yanj hurriedly whispered, My Highness, I can't tear this official suit. It was as if he would tear her clothes. The prince did not speak, and he lowered his head to bite the lips of Yanj. Yanj reached out to cover the prince's li after my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Wei Pang. Chapter 241. His Royal Highness, General Wu Wei, he seems to recognize me, but I did not admit it then. Rather than being questioned by the prince, Yanj feels as though he is frank and lenient, but also weakens himself and General Wu Wei. He knows that there is a mole on my wrist. Your Highness, can you find someone to help me get this mole removed? And the birthmark on my back, Yan Ji said weakly, ignoring the scorching glance that the prince had fallen on her face. His Royal Highness, I heard that there is a scorching sentence in the criminal law. I thought, whether my Highness can help me. Burn a piece on your back to cover your birthmark with burn marks. She reached out and took hold of a crown of prince, her voice begging, Your Highness, can you help me? But even at this time, she still used the male voice she used when facing others. He sat back slowly on the couch, staring at her blankly. Fire! This woman, she is not only cruel to others, she is cruel to herself. Yan Ji knelt in place, his voice croaked, His Royal Highness. Take a mole? Cannon, he sneered, his voice swarfing, can't you do this, you're not Chuji of this palace. Without saying a word, he snapped, Come here. Yanj moved on her knees. He reached out and tore off Yanj's clothes, and pressed it against Yanj's chest across a lining. Although tied tightly around the cloth, the place is still different from the flat man. Yanj subconsciously wanted to avoid it, but the prince clenched her cloth with her fingers. He didn't know where to find a dagger. The knife was cut into 2 pieces, but Yanj's body was not scratched by the dagger. This kung fu can never be done by anyone who has practiced it. This prince, what kind of guy is it? Yanj looked up and stunned him in shock, His Royal Highness. The prince raised his lips and stared at the words with a smile, If you really don't want to be Chuji, you can cut your body together. Yan Ji's eyes were filled with tears. She bit her lip and slowly bowed her head in the eyes of the prince, As long as Her Royal Highness does not dislike, I will always be His Highness Chuji. No matter what Her Highness thinks, it will always be in my heart such. Her hand rubbed his corner of the clothes and kneaded, using a woman's voice to cry weakly, His Royal Highness. His Royal Highness thought that His Royal Highness would like him to do a career like a man. Before she finished speaking, he pinched his chin. He lowered his head to her, his face was on her cheek, and whispered in her ear, The only thing I like in this palace is to do you. Words of song. What he said was really shameless. 2 people together, who is up and who is down? Yanj's eyelashes trembled, as if shy, and whispered, Your Highness, Your Highness, Your Highness likes it, Junjun is very happy. The prince held Yanj's hand on his clothes and ordered, Untie. Yanji weakly stepped forward to undress, His Royal Highness, Junjun's face has too much powder, and still, it is still male makeup. Although there is no palm light in the carriage, there is a faint halo on the top of the carriage. It was hard to see the thick powder on her face, but she could see her male face. Anyway, it wasn't that the fish had fallen into the water, and they felt that they belonged to the sea, so they disdained to turn around in his fish tank. The prince snorted coldly, held her shoulders, pulled her closer to her, and threw the wet towel from the box to her face. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Wei Pang. Chapter 242. As Yanj wiped away a little, the face that had not been seen for more than a year gradually appeared in front of the prince. This face is really exquisite, so delicate that he couldn't bear to ruin it at all. He traced her eyebrows with his fingers, and instantly pressed her under her. He did want her to know her mighty domineering. But there was no room for him to play in this small compartment, but she turned up a moment and pressed him underneath. She flamed on him, and hooked him with a charming voice, Your Highness, do you want it? Just ask the king. He was indignant that this woman had such good bed skills that she didn't know how many men she had hooked up with, and she would definitely have to frustrate her to relieve her hatred in the future. But the bodies immediately filled his mind again, making his bitter resentment turn into a bath fire provoked by her. The speed of the carriage was getting slower and slower. Later, he stopped directly, thinking that he had entered the prince's house. But the two men in the carriage were still in a sweaty battle. It's been more than a year of anger, and the carriage is a novel place. Naturally, it has fought so many times more than usual. In the end, the prince was panting, half lying on the couch, completely helpless. Yanj put on her own clothes, put on the prince's clothes, and arranged her appearance. She simply hugged the prince and got out of the car. The prince who reacted was glared, "I want to go on my own." Words, "My Highness, my chest is cold and flustered, holding you warm." Prince. Without waiting for him to respond, Yan Ji said, "Your Highness, you have lost a lot of weight." Why, this is because he was so anxious that he didn't have flesh. He raised his eyebrows, and was about to scold, listening to her and saying, "His Royal Highness, without His Royal Highness should take good care of himself, or he would feel bad." Huh, fancy words. He pursed his lips, and proudly glanced at her, but didn't speak again. Back at the prince's dormitory, Yan Ji waited for the prince to take a bath, and finally hugged people to bed. Ma Dan, her beautiful beauty, is now a Chinese girl who has gone to bed and got into the hall. Yanj wanted to go back to where she lived, but the prince pulled her clothes. "Night, live here." Okay. Yan Ji simply took a bath and lay beside the prince. The prince was probably really tired, except to take her in his arms, there was no other action. The song was meek and docile in his arms, thinking that this guy was asleep, but after a while, he heard him say, "There is no need to worry about General Wu Wei." He paused and said, "The Japanese palace to be changed has a chance to kill him." Words of song. His drowsy voice heard no murderous sound, just like murmur. But Yanj knew that this guy could definitely do such a thing. She didn't speak, and at this time, everything would be fueled by firewood. It would be better to discuss it in the future. Anyway, it is really not easy for the prince to be able to kill a General Wu Wei anyway. But the song didn't speak, but the prince was unwilling. He reached out and touched her face. "Junjun has nothing to say." Yanj was a little sleepy, but when the prince said something, she was reflective, and her pores were on alert. Who does His Highness want to kill? Whoever dares to provoke His Royal Highness, the king will kill anyone, as long as His Royal Highness has been good all along. After my death, the villain blackened again. Author, Ben Gong Wei Pang. Chapter 243. The prince opened his eyes, and under the yellow nightlight, the face of the woman around him was exquisitely like an elf in the dark night, as beautiful as dream. She closed her eyes as she spoke, her face a soft, contented smile. Seeing her like this, he didn't know why, and suddenly he calmed down. Even if she knew that she would protect that person at that time, at the moment, she could say this kind of words without hesitation. The prince didn't speak again. After a long time, Yanj felt relieved after feeling that his breathing was stable. "Chicken, how do you think the strange way you and Prince Edward get along?" Yan's song was a little sloppy. "Yeah. She hasn't been able to find the prince is the real hammer of the old fashionable waistcoat, but she can't help but be vigilant. Presumably this kind of vigilance makes her highly nervous all the time, so when she gets to bed, her nervousness becomes ** on vent. Chicken, I think you may have misidentified your gender before. You are most likely a male." Song, so. "You think, you have so many branches, maybe they are all your weapon. If you are a male, you will be more beautiful than a snake with a double whip. You can grow as long as you want, and short as you want. You can also have thorns or particles. No matter what kind of female can be conquered by you, you will be a winner. Song. How can she hear the creepy winner of such a tree-born winner? She was afraid that the cub would continue to talk and asked, "How is the brick now? It's not finished yet." Having given birth to 2 planes, her nickname has changed from a small brick to a brick. Who knows, the cub is still excited. You remember what it does, and you should quickly study yourself, and wait for you to become a male with countless weapons, then you will be the first in the world. The world's first song is not rare at all. She ended the conversation on the grounds of being dormant. Alas, I always feel that these guys around me are more abnormal. Yan Ji fell asleep sadly, and was awakened by a cough in the middle of the night. She crawled up to see the prince nearby. "His Royal Highness, what's wrong?" He had gotten out of bed and poured a cup of warm water to the prince's mouth. The prince drank the water, and then said to Yan Ji again, "Go, let someone call Wen Lao to come in." Yan Ji nodded. Wen Lao arrived soon and hurriedly entered the inner room with Kingda. Yan Ji stood in the courtyard and waited for a long time without seeing Wen Lao coming out, or Kingda came out and said, "His Royal Highness, let me take you back." "I'll go back by myself," Yan Ji said quickly, "he needs you here." Kingda glanced up at Song of Songs, but didn't hand the lantern to Song of Songs. He took the lead to lead the way of Song of Songs. Yan Song had to follow him. Out of the prince's courtyard, everywhere on a secluded bamboo forest path, Kingda slowed its pace side by side with the song, "His Royal Highness will get sick every time you are with you." He didn't wait for the words to respond, and immediately said, "Wan Lao said that His Royal Highness was fine, but it is very strange that every time I am with you, His Royal Highness will be weak for a long time. Chuji, your Royal Highness treats you better than ordinary people. If you really don't have a second heart, be your Song Zai Jun well, and stop provoking your Highness. If your Royal Highness has anything to do with you, I will never let go of your Chu family."